I'm Stephen Losco. Chris Dancy is our hashtag moderator. If you want to hashtag along with him, our session number is A7. So we are missing one of our presenters today. She couldn't make it. So it's just 3 of us, or 4 of us today. Let's begin with Leigh-Anne Goins, who's a doctoral student in sociology at Michigan State University, where she studies Black femininities, intersectionality, and new media.
My name is Leigh-Anne Goins. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology. My interest, in addition to Black feminism, Black femininities, intersectionality, and new media, is also social citizenship. And so what I did for my thesis was actually look at the series Black in America. I don't know if you remember when that came out in about 2008. It was around the same time that now President Obama was starting to run for office. It was a historic moment. And CNN was like, this series is going to be so amazing, and we're really going to talk about Blackness. And then it was like, wah, wah. It was not the best series, right? And so I was interested in how people engaged in the series and its online component. So there were 3 components: the Black man, and then achieving the dream, and then the Black woman and family. So women and family were conflated with each other. So I was like, fine, I'll go in there and I'll try to find something. And I found a story about Leah and her 3 friends who, on a casual Friday, dressed probably pretty much like I am, went into an Old Navy in Georgia and decided to go shopping. And then they were stopped by the police, not the security guards, the actual police. And they were held from anywhere from 20 minutes to about an hour and a half. The girls say that, or the ladies say it was an hour and a half. The police are like, it's 29 minutes, like, wasn't that long, right? And they were humiliated. And so Soledad O'Brien writes a story. She talks about racial profiling, and she says, talk back. Tell us what you think. So I'm like, well, this was a really interesting moment, raised for not necessarily the first time, but a first time in kind of a momentous occasion where we have the possibility of the Black president happening, Black in America is going on, so, let's kind of figure out what's happening and how people are responding. So I decided to analyze the comments, specifically to see how people engaged racism and sexism in online spaces, but through veiled language, so through colorblindness, right? But also taking Collins's controlled images, like the mammy, the matriarch, right, the angry Black woman, the Jezebel, etc. And what I found was that, interestingly, or maybe not that interestingly, people defended these 3 women being racially profiled. Well, Black women are on welfare and they're always stealing, so clearly that's why that happened. I have this friend who yells racial discrimination every single time something bad happens, and she teaches her children to be this way, right? So we have the matriarch coming across, right? And so these really angry depictions, and I was like, wow, so what does this mean? Like, we can see and we can theorize what's happening, but how does this affect Black women's bodies? How does this affect Black women's femininities and their engagement in society, generally speaking? So this kind of started my dissertation project. This is not my dissertation. My dissertation actually looks at scandal. So it's kind of fun, right? So I can talk about that later because I love my dissertation. But this is a project that I'm working on kind of in tandem with it, and it's the case of Quvenzhané Wallis, who was the star of Beast of the Southern Wild. So to give you kind of a background of where I'm going in my theoretical framework, I'm using the idea of social citizenship, right? So Marshall argues that social citizenship can be seen, right, primarily through 2 means: your access to education, your access to particular rights, economic rights, well-being, things like that. But then there's a second component, and the second component is actually what I'm focusing on. And that's right to positive recognition, that's right to value, to respect, and to belong to a community. To have narratives and discourses that state that you are valued, you're a productive member of society, you're not pathologized, you don't have problematic forms of femininity. And so what that creates is kind of a belonging or not belonging, which relates to idealized citizens or idealized bodies, where certain bodies are imbued with or garnered or granted certain rights, and other bodies are excluded from those rights, and that's historically dependent upon your access to citizenship. Not everybody was able to be a citizen. It wasn't until, right, the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we start to see more people being granted access to legalized forms of citizenship, but still to this day we have constrained access where some people aren't able to get married, right, because they don't have full access to these social rights. And so this exclusion is replicated through society, through ideologies, through discourses, and through really routine and patterned ways of having conversations. We don't even necessarily think about it, it just happens, and it's like, oh, whatever, it's microaggressive. I wasn't really racist, you know, I just think your hair feels like a Brillo pad, like, what are you talking about, right? So these things happen, but they happen consistently, and so what does that mean? And so for me, being interested in Black femininity, I look at how discourses of Black femininity are pathologized, where Black women have always operated in a binary relationship to white women, where white women are soft and dainty and submissive and to be protected, and Black women are angry and strong, and they had to survive, right? They didn't really have a choice. There's a line in The Daughters of the Dusk, you know, we're the descendants of those who chose to survive. There's not an opportunity to operate outside of that, and so this creates kind of the myth of the strong Black woman. And discursively, that reifies white femininity, it reifies white masculinity and Black masculinity, and it does a lot more than just to control Black women's bodies. And so that in turn constrains your access to positive recognition and to positive value and belonging. We can think back to Moynihan and, you know, his argument that, you know, Black women are the reason why these Black men aren't getting jobs and they're just too strong, and if they just knew their place, right, this submissive role that relies upon a binary white femininity, the problems with the Black community would just cease to exist. That narrative continues today. So what is the impact of that? So when you're positioned outside of the parameters of acceptable femininity, can you actually access social citizenship? That's what I'm asking. So I talked a little bit about this already. But so Black women are angry, they're hypersexual, they're the mammy, and our representations shape our realities. And so if Black women are consistently constructed as others and as improper and not adhering to standardized and traditional forms of femininities, then they can't access full social citizenship. So Harris Perry talks a little bit about this in her book Sister Citizen, and she uses the term of crooked room. And so what happens is, whether it's through juridical engagement or societal engagement, you receive racism and sexism, and it creates a feeling of being at a dis-ease, or being off kilter, right? So you're in a room that's not quite balanced, and you're constantly trying to navigate this space, and you're constantly trying to find balance. But for my work, so citizenship is bound in these really complicated ways and processes that we can look at in offline spaces, but what happens when it's online? What happens when you're engaging with these discourses in online spaces and it's not a materiality, it's not something that you can touch, it's not tangible, you can't punch the person in the face when they say something really nasty to you, you can't turn around and walk away, you don't necessarily have a choice of engaging with it. So I use the term crooked spaces, because I believe that it's online, so there's a non-materiality, and it's offline, which is a materiality, and there are active attempts or active engagements that are not necessary, right? So if you log into Twitter, you may not want to see that tweet, but it doesn't matter, you've seen it. You log into Facebook, you're just looking through your news feed, and for instance, I was reading a story about the little girl who gave Michelle Obama her dad's resume, and I'm like, oh my God, that's so cute, oh. And on Facebook, and then right below, it has stories you might like. U.S. Patriot, Michelle Obama is wasting taxpayers' money by, so I click on it, I'm like, what the fuck is this? And it's a story about how Moochie and Barry, I don't even know where the heck that name came from, are destroying our country. So I'm like, so now I, even though I didn't want to have to engage in this, I'm forced to engage in this, right? And so it creates that off-kilter, that being imbalanced, not having a solid footing. And it restricts my access, again, to positive recognition and positive value. So this is the process that I look at it through in terms of media, because I'm interested in what this happens. We have what people argue are fissures, or like little breaks that happen, but they're not. They're meaningful and they're consistent, and they happen on a daily basis. So So I argue that post-racial discourses, right, things that are like veiled racism and sexism, like your hair feels like a Brillo pad, something like that, it looks like Cheetos. Do you wash your hair every week? My dad said that was gross if you didn't, right? These microaggressive, clearly racist and sexist narratives, but are masked, exist in society every day. And then that translates when you see images of black women in media. So I'm using the case of Quantified Wallace. And then when you tweet or you post comments or you write articles, you recreate these post-racial narratives. You recreate these tweets, you retweet them, you favorite them, you like them, you whatever. And then that leads to a potential reconceptualization of black women's social citizenship and social exclusion through online spaces. This is what we need to understand, what this process looks like and how this affects black women in offline spaces. So the second part is the interpretation and effects of discourses within comments by black women. So that's what my dissertation focuses on. So I'm not necessarily going to be talking about this second arrow. I'm talking more about how this reconceptualization happens and what that potential effect could be for black women in online spaces. Oh, no? Maybe? Right. Oh yeah, you're clicking there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so Quantified Wallace. How many of you know Quantified? Oh, okay, so I really don't have to introduce her. A precocious little 9-year-old girl, as most 9-year-old girls tend to be, had this really cute little, you can't see the purse, but she carried around this little purse that was like an animal, like a kitty cat or a dog or something like that. Very sweet girl, star of Beasts of the Southern Wild, amazing movie. You know, she was the lead character in the movie, and during the Oscars, one of the youngest ever to be nominated for an Oscar, if not the youngest, The Onion, satirical newspaper, tweeted, everyone else seems to say, everyone else seems to be afraid to say it, but that Quantified Wallace is kind of a cunt, right? Hashtag Oscars 2013. So on its face, we can say, wow, that's a really messed up comment. Oh, it was The Onion, so it's satirical, it's just funny. But what about black femininity and black women's bodies allows one to be able to call a 9-year-old child a cunt? Right? Dakota Fanning, when she was in the movie with Denzel Washington, Man on Fire, nobody would have tweeted that about her at that time, right? That's absolutely unheard of. And that's because I argue the parameters and the boundaries of femininity or black femininity operate in such ways that these discourses happen. And that these consistent engagements create a continual and perpetual sense of imbalance or being off kilter, right? So these crooked spaces are things that you can't necessarily get away from, and so you're consistently having to renegotiate or having to attempt to renegotiate your access to social citizenship because it is always being challenged and it is always under threat. If you even had it in the first place, right? Your ability to even access it is consistently constrained. So I'm not really going to talk about the work that I did on this one because now I'm working on a comparative analysis. Because Quantified is Annie, the beloved orphan who is very pale with bright red hair, right? And so these are just some comments that I took from E! They are parallel to comments that I have seen on CNN, MSNBC, not necessarily that much on MSNBC, Huffington Post, Washington Post, and blogs, etc. So I'm not a racist. Clearly you are because you just said that you weren't. So nobody needs to get all up in my face, but Annie is white. She is known for fair skin and red curly hair. Annie is a huge American iconic movie, and you can't change who Annie is just because you want to prove something. It's just not right. Leave history alone, people, right? So in Hollywood, we consistently have brown, yellow, non-right and black bodies replaced by white bodies, and that's absolutely okay. But when brown bodies attempt to replace white bodies, we are reminded that their forms of femininity are absolutely not acceptable, right? And so they don't have access to this positive value and social recognition. So the black orphan Annie would be adopted by celebrities, and the poor white Annie would still be an orphan. She wouldn't stand a chance at adoption in today's world. Clearly they have absolutely no idea what's going on because white babies are snatched up and they're on waiting lists and black babies grow up in the foster care system, right? But we have this twisted, theoretical white supremacist system that we operate within that allows us to believe these things that's touted and masked by this idea of post-racialism. So I'm really interested in what this impact has and what it does for Black women in offline spaces, and that's what my dissertation is looking at. So I have 13 seconds left, and I'm done. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that. And next we have Deanna today, who's a doctoral candidate in the History and Sociology of Science department at the University of Pennsylvania, where she studies medical technologies and women's health. And she will be presenting Unpacking Cyborg Fertility, Natural Family Planning, and the Quantified Self. So, good.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today and to present this work in front of this audience, because I'm still trying to work out exactly what I think it all means. And I'll show you in 1 second.
Did you put it on desktop?
It's open in preview.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, so this thing that I'm working on is the relationship between practices of natural family planning, as epitomized in this manual, which is also known as fertility awareness, and the practices of the quantified self movement. This connection might seem a little bit ironic, given that there's not a lot of overlap in the general demographics of the practitioners of these two movements. Nor is there much overlap in most popular conceptualizations of what these movements mean, what they indicate about the social position and status of their members, or what they might indicate about their political motivations. However, what these two movements do have in common is a shared history of practice. They use the same tools, the same methodological frameworks, and they share the same epistemological underpinnings in their modes of thinking. So, really quickly, natural family planning is a system used by women to determine which days during their menstrual cycles they're fertile. To do this, they monitor several different physiological symptoms, including their temperature, the presence and consistency of cervical mucus, and their cervical position, and record those symptoms on standardized charts. Using these charts, they then analyze the changes that their bodies undergo during their cycles, looking for particular patterns that indicate fertile or infertile periods. Today, the most common users of natural family planning methods are women who are trying to conceive children, usually in conjunction with or as a precursor to more invasive methods of assisted reproductive technology. But there's a much longer history of natural family planning as a method of birth control, which is having a bit of a resurgence now, primarily among women who use it either for religious, political, or health reasons, or have otherwise decided not to use pharmaceutical or factory-made birth control methods. In much of the discourse about natural family planning, as opposed to the discourse of natural family planning, there's a type of stigma levied against practitioners as a social group, as well as against the underlying principles of their practice. This critique often comes from individuals who, if they don't actively self-identify as members of the quantified self movement, share their general demographics: educated, technologically literate, resource-rich, and largely male. These individuals, the quantified selfers, also take as their animating principle a system of quantified self-surveillance, but they track a much broader range of personal bodily indicators, from hours slept to calories consumed, from number of steps walked to quantified measurement of their pain threshold if they get headaches, for example. In contrast to the rhetoric of natural family planners, which is highly embodied and uses the fleshy particulars of women's bodies as its foundation, quantified selfers often talk about their practices as if through them they can eliminate their bodies altogether. Where natural family planners often refer to the scientific, physiological principles of their self-tracking, they do so in the service of proving their naturalness, showing that they are fully aware of their bodies and their many intricacies. Where quantified selfers discuss the rational mechanisms of their charts, they often do so at the expense of their embodiment, as if they might will their bodies to be purer machines, more technology. Which is to put aside, of course, that machines break too, just like bodies might. Maintaining the historical discontinuity, actually I'm going to take this away for a sec. Maintaining the historical discontinuity between natural family planning and the quantified self movement continues to have political ramifications. First, it exceptionalizes fertility, placing it apart from larger discussions of health and wellness, making it a separate sphere of concern only to women, or really of concern only to some women, a particular demographic of women for whom conceiving a child is her fundamental concern. It takes one component of a woman's biology and reifies its connection to a particular social role and all of the expectations and judgments that that implies. Second, this discontinuity can also have the effect of preventing us from thinking critically about the potential impacts of the quantified self movement. We have an extensive critical discourse that deals with the objectification of women's bodies, but by excluding the feminine and the feminist from the quantified, we're at risk of cutting ourselves off from a productive critique of the methodology of the quantified self. What does it mean for a tracker to turn their body, their mood, their diet, their whole self into a graph? What does it mean to make yourself into a quantified work object in a medical labor system? And what does it mean for both women and men to exclude this particular culturally loaded, physiologically complicated, and socially and politically important component of themselves, their fertile potential, out of that identity? This is particularly important as self-tracking transitions from the practices of niche communities to something that we're all expected to engage in. There's a newly reinforced imperative for patients to use diagnostic information technologies to gather and provide their physicians with data about their bodies and their healthcare practices. And if they don't, the only person to blame for their ill health is themselves. So since I'm a historian, this mode of being has particular origins in the history of the thermometer, which is what my dissertation's about. During the late 19th century, before it was used for fertility tracking, mothers were being actively recruited into the practice of thermometry in order to eliminate some of the burden placed on physicians by this new technological trend in medicine. When mothers were first instructed in family thermometry, professionals played on what they considered to be mothers' instinctive drive to hold and touch their children, encouraging women to take upon themselves the repetitive, intimate, and boring work of taking temperatures in order to save physicians from it. So despite the thermometer's ubiquity as both a physical object and as a metaphor, so taking someone's temperature just as often means assessing someone's opinion as it does their body heat, the thermometer has long been an almost invisible technology. And when it is thought of, its existence as a manufactured and scientifically calibrated object, one that's enmeshed in an infrastructure of other information technologies, is almost always obscured. I argue that this invisibility can be attributed to the fact that upon its introduction, the thermometer quickly became a feminized tool for gendered domestic labor. You can see that really evocatively in this design for a thermometer, which almost literally makes this thermometer part of a mother's hand. The implications of shouldering women with this kind of technological caring labor, I think, is where Donna Haraway and her Cyborg manifesto become relevant to this story. She writes, "By the late 20th century, we are all chimeras, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. This cyborg is our ontology. It gives us our politics. In the traditions of Western science and politics, the relation between organism and machine has been a border war. The stakes in the border war have been the territories of production, reproduction, and imagination." Haraway saw the emerging cyborg ways of being of the 20th century as an opportunity to remake fundamental categories of existence, an opportunity for a new kind of subjectivity to emerge, one that would resist binary and dichotomous characterizations, one that would have always been technological and natural, private and public, such that any distinctions would be meaningless. But something that needs to be asked, and which I'm trying to work out, is the extent to which Haraway ignores or evades the same kinds of historical connection that some quantified selfers do, the connection between reproductive cyborg practices and reproductive cyborg practices. Haraway acknowledges the militaristic origins of our cyborg selves in the developments of technologies of war, but claims that cyborgs are inherently capricious and unfaithful to their origins, in part because they're not born of two differently sexed parents in the traditional modes. New cyborgs, she claims, come into the world through a process more akin to the regeneration of a lost limb, an adaptation using whatever resources are available. But harder to shake off, I think, are the literally reproductive origins of our cybernetic selves. If cyborg epistemology was developed in part from the processes of controlling biological fertility, Can it ever really be divorced from the women's bodies upon which it was built? So natural family planning methods became established in the professional scientific literature during the early 1940s. And almost immediately thereafter, you see tools like this, which is the Ovule Index, quote, it says in the box, the woman's thermometer since 1948. For practitioners, the rootedness in a scientific methodology, using an instrument on their bodies and charting the results, has been always crucial to its appeal. They see themselves as scientific actors who are producing scientific knowledge about their bodies. One fertility educator said, "Doctors and research institutes heads up. This is clinical research." Today, fertility trackers often use charts that are generated with computer software. And before the 1990s, they would record by hand, but the charts looked pretty much exactly the same. When women are analyzing these charts, what they're looking for is the biphasic pattern, the temperature spike halfway through that indicates a change in hormone levels, which indicates that ovulation has occurred. And taking your temperature each day is just the first step. There's actually several highly complicated technological and social systems in place to help women interpret these charts and what they mean. They use mathematical formulas, they consult other women in person and largely online. They use software packages that tinker with the settings in order to find meaning. Technology developers are seeking to further capitalize on this practice beyond thermometers like the Ovule Index. Several new computerized thermometers have entered the market in the past few decades, and they explicitly combine the methods and rhetoric of the quantified self, including an emphasis on the technological over the embodied. This is an ad for the Lady Comp, the intelligent fertility computer. And what the Lady Comp does for you is it puts you in control. Except that actually, the major advertising agenda for the Lady Comp is that it enables women to abdicate control, because it allows them to delegate all of the interpretive work that you would do with that chart into the machine. One of its taglines is actually, "Wake up, measure, done." Most crucially, in the practices of selling this abdication, the makers of the Lady Comp assume that women will also be reassured to have the machine interpret her temperature data for her. Machine knowledge, obviously, being more trustworthy than the analysis that she might make on her own. As this brochure says, the Lady Comp, quote, contains a database of more than 900,000 cycles and uses biomathematical forecasting calculations as well as the very latest computer techniques. So with these really vague techno-scientific buzzwords that don't mention any of the actual mechanisms or specific calculations that they do, they're selling the Lady Comp precisely on the virtue that it re-black boxes the processes of women's fertile bodies. It does it so bluntly, in fact, that it literally reduces its information output to a red light or a green light. Red, you're fertile. Green, you're infertile. Go for it. Despite these tools, many women still resist this re-black boxing. They don't want to lose their deliberative power. Keeping the charts and the processes of interpretation more visible allows women to tinker with each technological and organic piece of the system, contributing to an epistemological orientation that almost completely elides these categories. Women are, as one tracking manual describes, quote, walking biological computers. Or, as another tracker said, I read my charts like they were sheets of music. Better than any photograph, they represented the real me. If we can understand this particular technological, social, and embodied feedback system, it dramatically changes our perception of where medical agency is located. Not only do we illuminate an entire system, the tool and the charts and the formulas and the forums, but also an entire labor history of medicine with implications that continue to structure and sometimes hide the work that patients do in managing their own health and bodies. Finally, as I alluded to earlier, sometimes these cyborg bodies break, and the equivalencies that we've constructed between the technological, the biological, and ourselves no longer seem so seamless. Thanks. The same 20th century manuals and 21st century blogs that showcase the success stories of natural family planning also host the voices of women for whom temperature checking didn't work, whose bodies, for any number of reasons, couldn't be disciplined. As one young woman put it after experiencing an unintended pregnancy, I was left with the feeling that I had failed at something that was my job. Far from being the perfect assimilation of cyborg bits, the history of natural family planning reveals the often overwhelming and sometimes impossible labor that goes into maintaining the practical and epistemological stasis of this assemblage. All bodies are messy and unpredictable, but women and their fertility remind us of that. We try to make our analog bodies, with their always changing, curvy messiness, into precise digital form, because uncertain things like cervical mucus make us uncomfortable. But building ourselves into a perfectly clean cyborg is kind of a lie, one that hides our labor, makes us compliant, and sometimes hides who we're doing our job for. In addition to tinkering with our technology and our routines and our software algorithms, we also have to find a way to recognize and reconcile ourselves to our fleshy, inconstant bodies. Thank you.
I'm gonna have to charge my phones.
I'll switch to it because I want to do it in.
Oh, you don't want to do it in
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just do it in. Yeah. Yeah, I'm a geek, I told you.
Can we grab another? Oh, I need to charge. Oh, yeah. Don't worry, I got it. Okay, so next we have
Nadav.
Nadav, sorry. Assor?
Assor.
Okay. He's an artist and assistant professor at Connecticut College, where he creates hybrid media with military industrial systems, and we are learning today about building a more perfect drone.
So hi, I'm really excited to be here, and I definitely think I'll sit down because I actually don't have anything printed, so it's here. So just get this ready. All right. So I do feel a bit like an odd bird here because the kind of let's say I'll call it research that I'm showing you is research that's involved in developing the projects that I'm working on. So it's basically a series of gathering information and generating thoughts that lead to certain projects that I'm working on that I'm going to show you some work in progress. And these projects all have to do with drones, but they have to do with drones from a perspective of thinking about the drone as, and it very much relates to previous talks, which is why we're in this panel, I guess, together, because it's thinking about drones as a body, as this kind of symbolic body. So as opposed to just thinking about it as a machine for surveillance, right, or something like that. It's also that, but I'm kind of interested in considering how it's a very powerful symbol that in a way expresses some pre-existing spiritual practices even, or myths even, right? Some of which go very far into the past and some of which are actually still being practiced today, and you'll see a project where I'm interfacing with somebody who's actually engaged in that. So yeah, I'll start telling you where I'm coming from. So the kind of, I do want to start just with putting it in context and mentioning that the kind of drones that I work with, they're much closer to the cute kind of guy on a leash that you see up there than to the kind of drones with a capital D that we all know and fear and often despise that have to do with the drone war, right? That's been happening for the last couple of decades, and that the U.S. and its allies are heavily involved in. And I do want to jump to these for a moment because interestingly, actually these, predators and reapers and all of these scary names have already become these really powerful, right, symbolic objects, and are literally here serving as a target for this, again, this kind of age-old ritual of constructing effigies, right? Construct effigies and, you burn them, all these sort of things. So to put that in context, and just a little plug because I think it's really important, that's not something I'm going to be talking on further on in the presentation, but the drone war that is a war, an actual war that's actually been happening for quite a while now, is I think incredibly important for anyone to be just informed about, and this is a great organization, Bureau for Investigative Journalism, that does the job of gathering huge amounts of data about it, so definitely check them out. And jumping back to where we are, so in the US, just to kind of lay out where I'm coming from in terms of the situation on the ground, the domestic drone situation is that this is a map of sites that have been, are currently operating medium and large scale drones in the US, but of course there are tens of thousands, if not more, smaller hobbyist scale craft like the little one on the leash that you saw, and like some of the ones that I've been working with. And the Federal Aviation Authority has been charged by Congress with, by 2015, providing as much as 30,000 medium and large scale drone, in general, commercial drone operation licenses. And what are they going to be used for? They're going to be used for, things from the kind of scary surveillance type stuff that you see here, and some of them are already being used for that, as you saw on that map. So, things like border patrolling, or, I just recently saw, I think yesterday, somebody tweeted about the LA police has been using, apparently, drone surveillance for almost 10 days, I think, without really telling anyone. So, currently there are still some mistakes that happen. But other fields in which this is a big push of the drone lobby, this is the first thing, literally, that they usually mention, is farming as an application for drones. So that's kind of heavily promoted. And of course, you've got your, pizza delivery drones and other kinds of actually self-quantification drones, right? So a drone that can run with you and measure your running and guard you, I guess, from the dangers of running. And selfie drones. To those who were in the panel earlier, and I'll get back to selfies later. So that was just kind of giving you a brief overview, and I want to talk about, again, my thinking about drones right now is that I'm thinking about them as this very convenient archetype. It's something that lets you package a lot of attributes that, and attributes that may be realized by different kinds of technologies, right? So let's say sensing, right? You've got hundreds, thousands of different types of sensing, different types of seeing, different types of locomotion, right? You've got bird drones or, helicopter drones or crawling or swimming, right? Different types of technology that are all attributes of this body, right? And that's, I think, something that needs to be discussed when you talk about drones, because we're talking about a body which is a symbol, which is a very powerful symbol. Because it's very convenient to represent this whole giant mess of technologies as this one object. And, as I kind of put on the asterisk here, right, it's often, said that, a drone is basically a phone with wings on it, right? Because it's all the package of technologies that you have in a phone or, in the cloud, but it's in a body that's moving around. So suddenly as you saw we have a live kind of human inhabited drone running around here. So you saw that one earlier. And of course, each of these things can be completely focused in this one autonomous being, or it could be distributed in a cloud, which when you give it bodies, it becomes a swarm, right? So the swarm of drones. And if you read some of the Defense Department's reports on their future military plans, a lot of them revolve around things like swarms of, little machines and things like that. So I started to think, okay, so we have this wide range of bodies, right? And some of these bodies, if you take them apart, take those different attributes apart, put them onto people, right? It gets into the whole kind of cyborg discourse, right? It becomes about bodies and about this ecosystem of bodies. So I like to call it a dronosphere. So it's really a whole range, right? So anything from bugs and giant hover planes and enhanced humans with wings and, dorky glasses and other, more subtle things. And the importance of defining it that way for me is that this idea of a body with these special attributes is an old idea. It's not a new idea. It dates way before technology, modern technology. So I said, okay, what if we push these things to an extreme? Because that's what I often do, when I work on projects that try to kind of mirror or distort, right, or reflect various military-industrial technologies, right, or things like that. So what happens if you take research and development in the kind of dronosphere and developing these different kinds of bodies and give them the maximum attributes, which, you know, I've talked to a whole bunch of scientists, and, you know, they often, right, that's in a way what's underlying a lot of the research, right? A lot of them would be very cautious to say that, but if you push, you know, then that's what would come out, that, yeah, you know, we want something, we want a camera that can see everything on all spectrum, right? In 360 degrees. So, you know, this guy here has a helmet that lets him see in 360 degrees, right? So that's the idea, right? So something that lets you see everything and lets you move as fast as you can and let you be invisible or be in many places at once, right? So you're starting to get to this mythological ideas, right? These things that have been driving these, have been giving this drive to people. In my opinion, that's one of the reasons that this research, right, is so driven to get there, because, you know, it's something that's always been around. So if you're talking about these flying beings that can see everything and so on, you're talking about, you know, spirits or angels or, you know, things like that, right? You're talking about mythological beings. And, you know, I'm not crazy in thinking that, apparently, because, you know, quite a lot of the drone units and drones themselves used by, for example, the Army, but also, you know, lots of others actually have literally mythological names, right? They have, you know, you've got Task Force Odin was the first military unit to use armed drones. You know, and it's taken its name of the Norse god that has these ravens that fly around with his eyes in their mouths, right, to show him what's happening in the world. And of course, there is the Raven drone, and so on and so on. There's a lot of that. So I've been thinking, okay, I've been gathering all kinds of these, you know, myths that I seem to relate to me to these ideas, and I became especially interested in Ezekiel's vision. So Ezekiel, one of the prophets from the Old Testament Bible, and he describes a kind of mechanical angel there, kind of that has, you know, surrounded by eyes and wings and spinning wheels within wheels, and describes it as making a sound like the roar of rushing water, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. So apparently it's loud and it makes a drone. So that was, you know, that was interesting to me because there was something very visceral about that description, and something that, you know, I kept thinking about drones. There is a really weird paradox, right? Because they have these bodies that represent so much, but we never see them, I mean, in real life, right? Unless it's that robot, right? But the flying ones, you know, they're a tiny dot in the sky. If anyone knows Trevor Paglen's wonderful photos of drones, that's what they are, right? You see a night sky or a day sky or dusk and a tiny dot somewhere, and that's it. Or you hear them, right? If you see interviews with people in areas that have been attacked by military drones, they can tell, right? They have a certain sound, but you can't see them, even though they're, you know, pretty massive. They've got a body. So I was thinking, okay, what if we take this mythical form and give it physical shape and let people just meet it, okay, just encounter, just to have this visceral physical encounter and see where we can take that. So that's where this kind of installation came. And what you're seeing are, you know, early studio kind of prototypes. The actual piece looks nothing like that, but my idea was, what if I take this model, okay, so again, looking back to the past of, you know, the colonial kind of world fairs, right? The way that people in the 19th century in the Western world were trying to, like, introduce foreign cultures. They would, you know, capture people and literally, you know, restrain them so that, you know, the more privileged people could walk around and feel safe and see them, right? And they had these dioramas, right? That would be like representative of where they come from, or, you know, wild beasts, right? Things like that. So I was interested in, okay, what if we generate a version of that by literally tying one of these machines up and letting it, you know, do its thing, and messing around with it a little bit, like amplifying the actual electronics so it generates more sound, or even making it sing. So it sings, you know, in this case, an excerpt from that same vision that I described to you earlier from Ezekiel. So I'll just show you a brief excerpt of that, some early tests. But we're not, something isn't right. No, you're not seeing anything, you're just hearing it. which is interesting. It relates to my idea, but you know, still. What if I do this? Interesting. And this is, we're using my own computer. So a friend of mine calls it art and technical difficulties. Let me see what I can do here. Well, all right. Well, I guess we'll just skip to the next one in this case, and we'll see if I can solve it later. So, so that's one, but that's one kind of type of. No, it's not going to do it. All right. One kind of type of encounter that I was really interested in. The other was out-of-body experiences, which kind of moving along the lines of the drone as this kind of spiritual symbol, because there is a whole subset, right, of people, and we're talking about people working with hobby drones. It's called FPV flying, and that's what it stands for first-person view flying. And the idea is you put a, you know, it's pretty simple. You put a video camera on the drone, you fly it around, you got goggles or a monitor or something, and you can see what it's seeing, basically. So you're, to a certain extent, right, you're visually inhabiting it. And that's really interesting because there's a whole genre of videos related to that, which, again, you probably, I don't know if you'll be able to see that either. No, of course, that's not playing either. Well, over there in the distance, which you would have seen us fly towards, is a guy that's, you know, sitting cross-legged in the middle of a field. It's the middle of the bush in Australia. So he hikes up there with a backpack and, you know, sets his drone down and puts his goggles on, and then he sits there and the drone goes off, right? And it, you know, makes this really beautiful video. And the thing is, he's seeing out of the point of view of the drone, so he's literally having, right, this kind of visual, at least, out-of-body experience. And I've been kind of obsessively collecting specifically the kind of videos where the people doing FPV flying actually shoot selfies of themselves, right? and it's interesting because apparently, so I've been talking to a bunch of people, and apparently it's considered, it's something that's a lot of them avoid because it's dangerous, because they have this common phenomena where they don't recognize their own body. Like literally, they feel. What?
Wrap it up.
So, so they literally often run into themselves with the drone. So to wrap things up, the last thing I'll mention is, as I was getting into working with people flying FPV, I found a guy that really combined everything that I've been looking at. So both the kind of mythical or religious aspect of drones and also FPV flying. He has a website called Flesh Pilot, and he basically considers himself a remote control minister and RC minister who uses, right, the fact that you can leave your body, right, and inhabit those drones to actually demonstrate that your soul can leave your body, right, and can thus, you know, you should work to save it and so on. So he's a really fascinating guy, and we've been shooting a documentary with him, which you won't be able to see the excerpt from for both shortage of time and technical difficulties, so this is just a still from that. But excuse me?
Flesh Pilot.
Flesh Pilot, yeah, fleshpilot.com. So, and the name of the guy is Jake Wells, and he's an amazing guy. He's a really fascinating guy, and basically he's got this whole theory about you know how drones can be a spiritual vehicle, right? So so with this I'd like to wrap it up and just with one other kind of angel, which is in this case the Angel of History. It's a painting by Max Ernst. And it's described by Walter Benjamin as an angel that flies towards the future, but its head is turned towards the past. And I thought it would be an interesting kind of figure to wrap this thing up with. So thank you very much.
So I would like to thank our panelists once again. I think they did an amazing job. So if anyone has questions, we'll first ask our hash mod what has been happening on Twitter throughout, and maybe ask a question.
So for Leigh-Anne, there's a lot of feedback around Annie and preserving history that really struck a chord with a lot of people. I'm not a racist, but really raced through the Twitter sphere. Deanna. A lot of people like the fact you said it wasn't a tech conference until someone mentioned the Cyborg manifesto. But there were two things. One, excluding the feminine and feminist from the quantified self again. Wait, what? So I think it was a question that maybe that person wants to explore more with you. And then someone said that you've convinced them to talk more about that the quantified self community could learn a lot from natural family planning. So I'm not sure if that's what you were trying to say or not, but that's what someone's wanted to know, maybe. And Nadav, big hit. I mean, it went silent. That usually means people were enthralled. So, but the takeaways were wingless phones or wingless drones and mythical nature drones. So, hard hitting questions with a lot of commentary.
All right. Well, anyone in the room have any questions? We have plenty of time. Please come up or get the microphone. So friends at home can hear your question.
My question is to the last presenter. What do you think about the association between these natural bodies and technological bodies as kind of almost like what are the political possibly ramifications or implications of that type of naturalizing? That there was a kind of, even in the agrarian metaphor that you're talking about, that there is a willful kind of association between drones and these helpful and quite innocent birds, that fly over the fields and fertilize or whatnot. What is the kind of the flip side of that type of association?
The flip side, you mean like in terms of negative, positive, or in terms of
I'm not sure it's negative or positive, but just the political implications of naturalizing technology in this way. Even equating it to a body, which is a quite natural, the technology itself becomes naturalized and legitimized in a sense.
Well, I mean, I think what is naturalized is a good question, right? Like, I think that it relates great to, the other talks, right, as well. And love to know what you guys think. I mean, because I think, I was talking about that sphere of bodies, and it feels like, right, it's, there was something, I'll talk about my experience in working with Jake, with the last person, for example, right? There was something really interesting in how, and completely different, right? I expected, right, I'm going to meet him. He lives on the Olympic Peninsula, and I was expecting to meet, often you have the stereotype of these, rich white guys, kind of suburbanite, creating these machines in their garages in their free time, and that sort of. But he was, he's like hardcore blue collar guy who, in a devout Christian, and he went through some very dark things in his life. He's got a very interesting story that he almost kind of transfers, a lot of the kind of, I guess, lessons he learned for himself into these machines that he builds from. They don't look like, imposing predators. They're pieces of wood with some foam board and rubber bands, right? And yet they do that thing for him of the vision. So that's, is that natural? Is that more natural? Or is that like a part, for him, they were literally a part of his body, like his spiritual body and his, in a way, his physical body too. And that made me think about a lot of this in a new light. So,
I guess I have flip ends of a similar story. The thermometer and the fertility planning is a body approximating a machine, and here we have a vision of a machine approximating a body. They're flip sides of a similar kind of discourse, but they're doing comparable kinds of work.
Yeah, and the thing I keep thinking of with respect to this is the cuteness of the drone on the leash, which is so interesting because I'm sure if you could hear it, it would make that same horrible, creepy, sinister sound, but it was kind of adorable on the leash. And what that means for how we understand what this technology is, like we all feel like our phone is naturalized in some ways because it has become like part of us and what we're doing. And my iPhone's very pretty and I kind of love it because it's so pretty, but that's a kind of emotional work that the technology seems to be doing that's curious and I think deserves more investigation.
Yeah, I agree.
Great.
Hi, my question's for Leigh-Anne. So that screen cap that you had about the remake of Annie, like let history lie and let history be. I think that's really interesting because I'm in a design and technology program, and often in our listservs there's like, you know, people kind of like addressing or complaining about the way that certain phrases are being used in technology, like master and slave. So there's this big discussion, you know, people just jumping on the topic, and then one individual actually said, you know, like the fact that you even pointed this out, targeted towards like people of color, like you should feel offended by this, like that action itself is racist, and I think it's really interesting, like yes, this happened in history and like different countries, you know, but is the fact that it happened in history, like can we not apply it now to the present as a critique, or like it's just really interesting how that is right now, and I was wondering like what thoughts you had about that.
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because I think that I think in some ways the pushback in terms of preserving history occurs on different fronts, right? So there's this idea that there's an Americanness in terms of Annie, right? That there's this ideal Americanness, and that we are sullying the image of what it means to be an American. And so by having a brown body replace a white body, we are removing a part of history that is quintessentially American. And so now it's becoming something that is othered, and something that is not acceptable, and something that is not desired. And so in some ways it is denying and controlling our ability, right? Or removing the ability to control this very structured understanding of what it means to be an American, and what American cinematography means, right? In ways that we didn't necessarily, we did see the pushback in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, right? The remake where it was Ashton Kutcher as the white man instead of Sidney Poitier, right, as the black man. And so there wasn't as much pushback, well, there was some, but not as much, because it wasn't this historical figure that represented so much and people had this attachment to, this desirability to be like or to equate themselves to. And that black femininity essentially does not lend itself to being equatable, right? Black women cannot be a substitute for white femininity, where white femininity can be a substitute for any type of body, right? So that's where I see the tension occurring. Anytime you're attempting to renegotiate history and include brown bodies, it's absolutely not acceptable. In most instances, yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Twitter?
People are talking about cute little drones.
Leigh-Anne, I had another question for you, which is difficult to answer, so we can sort of also just sit on it. But I wonder, I love the crooked spaces idea, and I wondered, like, what are strategies for leveling? You know, like how does that? How do we begin to, you know, approach leveling spaces and
removing that dis-ease, right? Removing that feeling off kilter. That's actually a really interesting question, and probably maybe even a week ago, I don't think I would have had as not necessarily good, but intriguing answer as I do right now. So with my dissertation research, I'm looking at scandal, and I'm looking at how people use veiled racist and sexist discourses to discuss Olivia Pope, right? And so I have my results, and it's really bifurcated in terms of what happens on Twitter and then what happens in the blogosphere and responses to news stories. And a lot of that has to do with the large amount of, quote, black Twitter, right, engaging in scandal and it being a cultural phenomenon. So without Twitter, I absolutely see these incredibly racist and sexist narratives that are happening out there. And so I'm interviewing black women, and so I'm saying, well, you know, this is the narrative that's out there, and, you know, so what do you think, and how does this affect your ability to belong and your access to, you know, positive recognition? And it's like, oh yeah, I mean, I see that. But, you know, Olivia Pope is really interesting because she is a mess, but she's human. she's flawed. And black women should be able to be flawed and should be able to have that full sense and acceptance of humanity that other bodies are able to have and are able to engage in. And blackness does not always map onto black women's bodies because it tends to be androcentric, right, as a concept. And so that's a problem. Scandal operates in a post-racial fantasy, so that's a problem, right? So we have all of these things that could be problematic, but at the same time, there's this pushback from the women I'm interviewing and are saying, well, yeah, that's happening in these online spaces, but when I watch this show, it's almost like a place of respite, right? It's a place, not necessarily of home, but even though she's a mess, I feel like she's human. And I hate her and I love Melly, or I love her and I hate Melly, and I love Jake, or like whatever it happens to be. But it is this engagement with the possibility of a new acceptance of black femininity. And that in some ways is countering, right, this off-kilter nature or this imbalance, these crooked spaces that are happening. I don't think that it's an end-all be-all because every day, right, there was the Jen Carroll, she's going by now, who had the yoga, I don't know if you know about this, but she was blogging about, it was on OK Jane, she blogged about being in yoga, and there was a heavy-set black woman, and she was like, oh, she was staring at me, and and I didn't know what to do, and I just felt so badly for her, and I mean, she was trying to navigate her positionality in an incredibly awkward and very problematic way, right? So we have these consistent moments that happen over and over and over and over and over again. So to really have a full ability to challenge that, I'm not certain, but that is what I hope to do with my work, right? As I move forward. But I think one of the interesting findings for my dissertation anyway will be how Olivia Pope, in some ways, provides a little baby space of safety, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, one of the ways.
You had a question from Twitter.
I was given permission to ask a question myself, not as the house mom. So I'm occupying my own self now. I'm not speaking as Twitter. So back to the quantified self and the family planning. Did you think there was something the movement could learn, or I couldn't tell where you were lying on that. I wasn't paying attention either because I was watching Twitter.
I think if there is a lesson I think it would be important for quantified selfers to take from natural family planning, it would be that just as difficult as it can be to enact natural family planning is as difficult as it can be to enact any kind of quantified self program. It's a lot more clear-cut and obvious when natural family planning fails, just because of the nature of what it is. But I think that the same problems are apparent in the process. And I think that there's something, I love that last quote about the woman feeling like she'd failed at her job, that there is a difficult, laboring relationship that you have and you create with your own body when you're using these tools. And it's important to recognize what that is. And I'm not swearing off all of modern medicine and all of self-tracking, but we have to recognize how it's working and what relationships it's hiding and creating anew, and who you are working with and for when you're doing these things. And I think it becomes more obvious when you're talking about women's bodies because they're more visible in a particular kind of way, but is applicable to all bodies.
And then one for, when you said I'm not a racist, but just for me that really struck home because as a gay man, I have a lot of people always say to me, I'm not homophobic. And what really pisses me off about that is unless you're queer, you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know what homophobic is. You've never experienced it. You're not gay. So I was wondering, do you draw any parallels with race? I mean, can I even understand what racism is?
Oh. So I actually struggle with the term racism because I think that as a society we live in a white supremacist, right, structure that, right, that, yes, that encapsulates much more than race. So when we talk about racism, I think what people are actually talking about is a discursive structure or linguistic pattern that attempts to control and subjugate certain bodies. And I think that if you don't have a clear understanding of what that ideological structure is and what that linguistic format looks like, then you don't truly understand what it means to be racist. You're just a fucking bigot. Yeah. So, right, so there's the guy, what's his name? Barney? Thank you. Who is, you know, black people would have been better off in slavery, and everybody's like, oh, he's a racist. And I'm like, I'm really not necessarily certain that he is. He lives in a white supremacist structure and he's adhering to a particular ideological structure, but I don't know that he's a racist. He's definitely a bigot, hardcore. But that, I have issue with how people brandy that word about and use it a lot because it tends to lose its power. And it's like, well, I'm not a racist. No, you're just a really big douchebag who and uses these terms to intentionally oppress other people, right? And even if that's not what you mean, because once it's in an online space, your intent no longer matters. Your discourse operates completely outside of your body, and anyone can access it. And so it doesn't matter whether or not you're racist. It matters the type of structure your language is using.
Do you have one question in the back?
Raise your hand. Who wants a question? Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this succinctly, so I apologize if I need to restate it. But so a thread that I saw coming together between all three of the different presentations, which makes sense because it's a talk about biopolitics, right? Is there's something going on in terms of a kind of neoliberal work of drawing populations, and what I thought was really, and I think you know, the one of the ways in which I was working, right, is there's a white supremacist fantasy, right, which is Annie, which then becomes history and becomes something that actually happened, even though it's always just been, right? You know, with the quantified self, right, there's this move towards the complete individuation, right, of embodiment into kind of basically like analytical spectrums of capacities, right? And that all seems connected to me to a lot of the drone discussion, you know, this sort of idea of trying to make the drone that can see the whole world, right? That, which is, you know, in some ways the oldest, you know, that's like the oldest theological, right, desire, right? God is there and sees all of the possible. So I'm wondering if, and something that connected them all for me is that there's been a real recruitment of the kind of faith in the drawing of these populations as being an active strategy that must be pursued, right? So, so I was wondering whether, you know, if you all had thought about what the mechanics were by which, like, at this particular moment, that kind of real investment in making this neoliberal, like, individuated, you know, analyzable self, right, can come to be. Because it seems different to me, and in this conference, right, I think especially in the context of this conference, it seems different to me than like a mode of kind of like racial structuring or gender organization or like technological fear that we might have seen like even 20 years ago, right, in which, you know, when maybe control was happening, but there was not the same level of investment in the sort of individuating self. Does that make sense? So I'd be curious to hear if any of you had, you know, could think about some of the kind of connections or why maybe now and how those mechanics are operating.
I need a second to think about that.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
It's a really good question.
I don't know. I can try to like I'm thinking about it from the direction of, I guess, technological development or you know, like research and development is. I feel like maybe it's not that it's this or that, like the mode that it was 20 years ago or now, or whereas now it's gone to the point, right? And you know, let's speak really just materialistically, like technologically speaking, to the point where you could have these physical distributed, right, bodies, right, that you just couldn't have, you couldn't afford to have, right? Now, they're made for like a few cents a, piece. So you can suddenly have these vast swarms of bodies that you just, that was not even a thinkable thing, like a decade ago or two. And then you start having a spectrum, I feel like, right, between this like centralized kind of model and the kind of completely distributed one. So maybe it expanded into that, right? So people are, but I think once this kind of swarm of bodies becomes an option, yeah, then it's an open question, like where things are going to go. But yeah, I'm interested in hearing how you guys think about that.
Yeah, I keep seeing like neoliberal capitalism and 1,000 think pieces about people working as individual consultants and freelancers and managing their personal brand, and then personalized medical care and Fitbits and taking responsibility for maintaining every moving part in my existence so that I can be better suited to serve different classes of professionals at every turn. And that I feel trapped.
Actually, I think that relates to an earlier thing that you said, I think in answer to what Chris, I think, asked, because there's something very disciplining about, right, these systems. Mm-hmm. And, some of the slides I took out in order to make time talked about how, the flip side of kind of this dronosphere is, you take your iPhone and you put it on the, there's a panorama app. If anyone's used that, and it's choreographing you, which is amazing to me. Like you have this thing, and it's telling you what to do. It's saying, no, move more slowly, move up, stop. So, not to mention GPS navigation, right? And you drive like an idiot around a parking lot because it's like that's what it told you to do, right? So it's like you're being disciplined, right? You're being to behave in a certain way, right, or to write down the values.
Right, and yet I'm afraid of attributing all of the agency to the technology, right? Somebody designed that technology to tell you to do a thing. And so a doctor designed a thermometer and a chart to get a woman to do his work for him. Google Glass developers created standardized codes to get people to do certain kinds of white dude bro things. And that's not just because that's how the technology is, it's because somebody made a choice to make it that way.
We have one, how quick is your question?
We'll see.
Okay.
This question is for Leigh-Anne. You mentioned before that you were making a distinction between racist and bigots. And I was wondering, just sort of thinking within a frame, because around the same time Melissa Harris Perry wrote Sister Soldier, she also essentially said that you're racist until proven otherwise. So how are you making this distinction between racism and a racist and a bigot and bigotry?
Okay, so when I think about racism, I think about a more systematic and willful intent to oppress another person through your actions, right? And so I think about it more as a macro and less of a micro engagement. So if you're an owner of a company and someone comes in to be hired and you refuse to hire them, right? We can say that that was a racist act where you consciously and willfully affected their ability for economic engagement and employment. I think that there's racist or a racialized structure of thinking that people engage when they're having conversations with each other, right? So in thinking about the last question that was asked and thinking about technology, the use in the last 20 years, we have this technology and we use it to do a lot of different things. And so rather than the state having to control and police bodies through these grand scale means, we now have our phones and we now have our abilities to engage these discourses to impact and to control bodies and to tell them what they can and cannot do, right? And it's very individualized and it's very personalized, but it still has that same effect. It still regulates what you can and what you cannot do. But I don't see that operating in the same way on a micro scale. So that's where I see the difference. And I think that for me, bigot allows the ability for it to operate outside of just race. So I talk about black femininity and black women, and I don't think that saying that someone is a racist completely attends to what their narratives actually do, because they're also engaging sexist narratives, right? Calling a black woman a cunt isn't just being a racist, you're also being a sexist. So do I call you a raxist? Like, I'm really not certain what that term would be. So I tend to fall back on a more generic term of a bigot, right? Which means that in general you have prejudiced belief systems about a particular group that you use to control how you think about them, or you tell them like you are not worthy or you are not X, Y, and Z. So that's part of my tension in terms of using, well, this is clearly racist, because I also talk about sexism. And I think that's very much apparent, and we don't necessarily have as clear and in-depth conversations of the effects of sexism in tandem with racism in the contemporary discourse.
Okay, well with that, I'd like to conclude the New Flesh, Bodies and Biopolitics. Thank you for all attending.